Hey everybody, this is Ian. Today we're talking about Andrea Meyertholen's Rumpelstiltskin's Queer Secret, Non-Binary Bodies Buried Between the Lines of the Brothers Grimm. One of the things that I love about academics, one of the things I love about the humanities, and the arts and the social sciences for that matter, is the way that every piece of new research, every piece of new interpretation and exegesis is a pivot from what went before and an effort at trying to interpret something that often something that we thought that we knew, providing a new interpretation as emergent words, emergent concepts come through, filtering them into what had previously been perhaps established, maybe even settled arguments. And this is what Meyertholen is doing. And the thing is that you don't necessarily 100% have to be convinced by an argument. It should still be held up to scrutiny, and it could still leave you at least pending convinced. I'm fairly convinced by what she's talking about. I think it's really excellent. But what's more important is that if you do wish to refute it, you've got to refute it based on the argument that she presents. And her argument is so very strong that I do find it convincing. And it's just kind of wonderful. So, I mean, the humanities and the social sciences are really nothing but the reading of complicated texts, and not the complicated texts in terms of Meyertholen, although that's an argument to be made because her argument is complex, but that she herself is reading a text. She is reading Rumpelstiltskin. She's reading the Grimm's versions of Rumpelstiltskin, which is a product of human exigency and creativity, and is therefore one of the most complex things that can be. And yeah, so I just really kind of love this article in a way. Meyertholen is not a folklorist by training. She did go to Indiana University, but for German. And IU has this remarkable reputation for languages as well. It's one of the great centers in North America for languages, literature, and it also happens to be where the Folklore Institute and the Folklore Department at IU was founded. So that, her IU connection doesn't necessarily cement anything in terms of folkloristic cred, but she is citing the people. She is doing the work. She's aware of the literature, and I am more than willing to go with her that way. And that seems like I'm doing a bit of gatekeeping, but one of the things that is sometimes a struggle when we talk about folk literature is that there has been 200 years or so of folkloristic understanding of it, and often people will sort of swoop in from literature, particularly will swoop in and treat them as texts, treat them as pieces of written literature, and also be picking from specific examples that have gone through some kind of literary amendation. They might have even gone to a literary text entirely, like a Hans Christian Andersen or something, and start making definitive statements about what the folk tale is, what this particular folk tale means to people, means to the folk, or means to national character. It's just like your methodology is completely flawed. She's not doing this. So the gatekeeping is not necessarily petty. Hopefully, it's not too petty on my part. But she is using the Grimms. She is using the work of the brothers Grimm, Jakob and Wilhelm, and they are problematic in many ways because they, despite their stated intentions, they did not collect these texts in a sort of pure ethnographic folk context. They did not go out and collect them in villages from a particular speaker. They tended to get them that are already filtered through some kind of urbanity, which is fine, except it sort of presumes that there is a purity there. They're making this argument for purity when the thing that they would consider pure has already had some kind of interception with it. They're collecting from often like household staff because they're in the middle of the early 19th century, and they are in German city centers, and people had servants, and those servants came from the countries, and so it's like matrons and nannies and people, a lot who they collected from. They would also have no problem taking various tales and mushing them together, either various versions of the same tale, or cut and paste and sort of assemble something that they thought was more representative of something, whatever that something was that they were trying to achieve, as a form of literature or as a form of insight into the folk consciousness. And then as they went along in their later editions, because the publishing of their book, Kinder- und Hausmärchen, in 1812, it did institute a phenomenon. You know the name Brothers Grimm, even if you don't necessarily even know that they are real people. Because it instituted such a phenomenon, it almost created that category of children's literature. We have these texts, they can be told to children to inculcate, so they can be told to everyone, but they can specifically be told to children to inculcate German values, because that is sort of the nature of the exercise, that this is a literature that rises from the very soil itself. It speaks to concepts of national character. It's like, what if we're going to be using these as pedagogical devices? Maybe we should tweak it a little bit here. And what is the German character that we wish to have? The German character that would be best suited for an emerging capitalist economy in the 19th centuries. So we have sort of a manufactured, in some way, patterns of masculinity, manufactured patterns of femininity. Later editions talk about piety a lot more. There's a lot more Christian references in the fifth edition than there is in the first, and it's kind of ick. But then she makes this really interesting point, and she says that the Grimms always wrote in drag, because not simply were they collecting from some nannies and so on, that was one of their markers of authenticity, that they were collecting it from these people. So although many of them were not named, well, some of them were, and prominently, and then the tales were meant to be coming from that voice. So these youngish men in their mid-20s were writing, or were rewriting, but rewriting as they imagined the idealized, perfect German grandmother would be telling them. So this notion of sort of a gender play is there. It's kind of an interesting vibe that, it's a note that she's introducing into her argument. In addition to trying to recreate the history of the tale itself, the history of how this thing that we call Grimm's Rumpelstiltskin emerged, and reconstructing the history of the thing. One of the, which is a noble enough pursuit, but one of the reasons that we still study fairy tale, and that we still study tale in general, and why we still study it both in its historical context and as it's told today, as we keep on looking at adaptations of it, why the tale as a toolkit is, and a shared bundle of repertoire that can be plucked out and then reapplied into any kind of situation. Why we still look at that and look at the creativity is that we can get insight into the issues of the worldview, issues in the worldview of the tellers at the time. That we can, and it might be a reconstruction, and therefore it's something that is a tentative conclusion, but nevertheless, it is something that, okay, we can look at these tales, do a deep reading of these tales, and see if we can figure out exactly how, what were some of the concerns or themes that were present, that tale was being used to explore. And so she presents us with Rumpelstiltskin, but first she sort of puts it into the sort of glamorous context of, well, when were these stories told? We sometimes romanticize, and we will talk about, these sort of family occasions and the notion of the hearth and everyone getting together, and a beloved, trusted figure with a command of the repertoire speaks and tells the tales almost verbatim from the last time that he or she told them. And everyone listens and appreciates and so on. And that did happen. We have ethnographic accounts of that. Christensen will talk about that when he does his stuff in Denmark. That these were at least, they were group occasions just as often, but they're told in other contexts as well. They're also often told to accompany labor, because labor can be monotonous. And if you had people who were doing something that was reasonably, it required a minimal aspect of concentration. Once you become skilled at it, then it is a matter of taking time. And one of the things that is notable is the act of spinning itself. That it is a skill set. It is a complicated thing to do, but once you achieve a certain mastery of it, it's something that you can more or less do in sort of a repetitive-like fashion. And because you've seen people who are adept at things, and it's like they're not even paying attention at all, and yet their fingers are always doing the exact same thing at the exact same time. But they seem to be able to carry on a conversation. This is the context. So what do you do when you're like 8 hours, 10 hours a day in what is fundamentally a precursor to a factory where people are gathering together and spinning all in the same room? And it's just like, well, you tell stories. And spinning was a women's craft. It was a woman's livelihood. And so these were all women occasions. This was not the same kind of public event. And she seems to indicate, Meyertholen seems to suggest that Rumpelstiltskin was a conspicuous tale told among spinners, not coincidentally because it has to do with spinning, the spinning of straw into gold. But again, with each time, there's something. The tale allows for it to be. The tale allows for a topic to be introduced and at least played with, not necessarily discussed, not necessarily hammered out, not necessarily negotiated, but like, I'm just going to bring this idea, and we don't know what we're talking about, right? And everyone's like, yeah, we know what we're talking about. So this is the description this is Rumpelstiltskin, ATU 500, the name of the supernatural helper. So this is from, I'll just read it straight from the Arne Thompson Uther Index. So, name the supernatural helper, e.g. Tom, Tit, Tot, Rumpelstiltskin, Rumpelstiltskin, as he has it, Trillavip. A father or a mother boasts that his daughter can spin gold or impossible amounts of yarn, or a mother beats her daughter because she is lazy. The king asks why, and the mother says she will not stop spinning. H914. The young woman's talent is to be tested, and she is shut in a room to spin. H1021.8, H1092. If she fails, she will die, but if she succeeds, the king will marry her. She cries. A supernatural being, a little man, agrees to help her, D2183, if she will promise him her first child, or herself, if she cannot guess his name, H521, S222, S222.1. In some variants, she has to remember his name after a long time. The young woman passes the test, and the king marries her. After a year, the little man, certain that she could not guess his name, comes back to take her child away. By chance, the name is discovered by a servant, the husband, or the woman herself, when the little man sings it triumphantly in the forest, N475. When the woman says the correct name to the helper, he vanishes or sinks into the earth. So there's been a history of trying to interpret this particular tale, how it's told, why it's told, and Harry Reid has a sort of a Freudian take that this is a tale about impotency. This is a tale about male impotence, personal experiences with male impotence to humiliate and retaliate against powerful men. So Rumpelstiltskin is taking his revenge on people he's envious about, more potent people, the king, the miller, and subsequently, and how he's taking revenge by stealing the child, something that he himself cannot do. And it sort of reinforces this idea and the theme that was, she's not disputing, this theme that within 18th and 19th century Germany, women were essentially fundamentally property, shifting from household to household. So sort of this passive idea, or this lack of agency, I should say, that women have, and that could then be exploited by others. So it mocks maledom while also preparing them to accept harsh realities about actual, not idealized men. So as they're sitting around and spinning, they are recognizing that they are being subject to toxic masculinity and toxic patriarchy, while simultaneously recognizing that this is not actually a particularly impressive group of people. They just happen to be the ones in power. And then that's the symbolism. But she makes a different argument, and she makes this lovely, fascinating argument that we shouldn't be thinking about this binary. We shouldn't be thinking about Rumpelstiltskin as a little man, but basically Rumpelstiltskin is fundamentally this intersex, this non-binary person who is neither nor. A series of quotes, she says. The more tantalizing implications are unearthed when we regard Rumpelstiltskin not as another instance of men behaving badly, but as something other than man at all. Rumpelstiltskin is not interchangeable with or symbolic of the tale's other men, but instead represents a non-heteronormative or queer sexuality and constitutes another marginalized social group within the same hegemonic regime victimizing the miller's daughter. My irresponsible reading, and this is what I was talking about in terms of reading with new eyes, but also reading not being beholden to the text that the way we imagine it had to have been. My irresponsible reading goes against the grain to uncover how the title figure subverts the tale's central heterosexual patriarchal structures with a non-normative, non-binary queerness that threatens the essential construct of masculinity and femininity alike. And this is what she's trying to convince us of. And just the idea of this sort of irresponsible reading, or it has to do with, we have this event, we have this tale, we have this moment in time where someone is expressing something, whether that is within the spinning room itself and the actual putative old woman telling the story amongst a group of other women doing a similar task in a very sort of communitask form, or whether we're even talking about the versions that the Grimms ended up publishing, that they do so. We can read into things. We can read possibility in the text that might not have been intended, but we as listeners, we as readers, are co-creators of that text. And it's actually in sort of conversation with either the performer or the author. That's fundamentally, I'm being a little bit oversimplifying. That's fundamentally one of the bases of doing what they call queer readings, of reading possibility, reading interpretations into a text, knowing that we ought to be, that our discipline, the way that we had been taught to be responsible readers, was to respect the author and their creation. It's like, well, yeah, I still respect the author, but I allow for possibility, and I allow for a different interpretation, one that might be radical. And because my interpretation is so rooted in the text itself, I'm paying attention. I am reading that text, but I am going somewhere else with it. And this is what she's doing. So one of the things that she points out is that no one in this tale is a particularly nice person. This is not a hero and villain tale in the way that we typically expect a fairy tale to go, because there is no one who is inherently essentially good and pure, and there's no one who maybe there are people who are entirely bad, but the miller sets his daughter into this nasty contest, allows the daughter to be used in this way under threat of the daughter's own life. The king enters into this contest, he suggests it, and in this weird form of property exchange, and the daughter makes this glib promise to give away a child. No one is particularly good. You can make an argument that, in a way, Rumpelstiltskin is the only good one, because Rumpelstiltskin is the one who is fundamentally both talented and a nurturer and trying to make people, give people the help that they need. They can't have a child of their own, so they want one. But they only come back not to steal the child. They come back to collect on a promise that was made. So no one is particularly great. We can skip through some of the parts where we talk about, remember I talked about revisions in the Grimms over the various editions, but in the early editions, in sort of the natural context, the task was that she was only able to spin straw into gold, that was her problem, that she wasn't actually able to contribute to her core economic function within a folk society, which is spinning, straw into flax or whatever it is. I don't know enough about spinning to say comprehensively what she was meant to be doing. But so the economic power was something that she didn't have. She wasn't able to contribute in a way. She could only create this sort of weirdly magical but not immediately essential thing, expressed whimsically. In later editions, spinning it into gold is the point, is the object, because this is more about fitting into the heteronormative, masculinist, binary way where women's economic power and women's economic contributions are not part of the conversation about what is actually relevant. So the question also comes down to, well, what is Rumpelstiltskin? A gnome? The translations will say things like little man. There's a sort of spurious, or it's not spurious per se, but the idea that is actually it's sort of short for crumpled stalk, which is representative of flaccid penis. Again, going back to that notion of fundamentally encountering male impotency. It's like, it's fine. I mean, that is an interpretation. You can go for it. Maybe it is completely a nonsense word. And the nonsense word is something worth considering just for a second. Because if it is a tale that has to do with the presence of this liminal figure that does not conform to a binary of masculine and feminine and is non-binary some way, but we are living in a culture that doesn't have those terms, does a purportedly nonsense term thereby become the representative term for when we don't have an actual word for it? It's like, oh, I don't know, he's like a real Rumpelstiltskin. And I used he there on purpose. Like, I don't know, it just doesn't fit into our category. So I'll throw a nonsense term. In the same way that we're like, when you can't remember the name of a thing, it's just like, oh, pick up that chummy jigger or something like that. And so that's my favorite Newfoundland term, the chummy jigger. But just the generic something. Maybe Rumpelstiltskin sort of fits into that mode. So it is a kind of an interesting thing, because then then the later task about identifying by name becomes doubly important, because the name of the helper is the key, is the answer. Then, and this is what I love most of all, and I love it despite the fact that I technically don't understand it. I can follow the thrust of her argument, but she is going hardcore into some German grammar, because she reminds us that this was written down in German, that this was spoken in German, and that German doesn't only have masculine and feminine nouns. It also has the neuter. And so if you've done your high school French, you know that there's masculine and feminine. We don't really have it in English, except for a couple of things that are specifically designed to differentiate gendered titles and things like that. But German has three. German has the neuter. And so she walks us through how much there are male characteristics, the king, and the miller. There are female, and the use of the masculine nouns and adjectives. There are the female characteristics, the daughter, and using using the feminine nouns and adjectives. And then there's Rumpelstiltskin, and their characteristics are betwixt and between, and using the neuter. So on the level of language, we already have this possibility of something that is at the very least neither nor. And it might make hardcore grammarians need to reflect on the nature of the neuter in this instance. And that's subject for another day and subject for grammarians and not subject for us. But at least it entertains that the people who were speaking this, again, grandmothers at the spinning wheels, and then the Grimms themselves were aware of using these terms. And this is where the queer reading comes in, the irresponsible reading and so on, is that because the preponderance of the neuter was being used in order to discuss Rumpelstiltskin, does the neuter open up possibilities that the spinners were aware of and the Grimms weren't? Because the spinners were not as educated as the Grimms. The Grimms started the German dictionary. The Grimms were educated, literate people, and there's no sense necessarily that the people they collected from were literate, let alone as literate as the Grimms. But were they playing with? They clearly have a facility with language. Were they playing with the facilities of language already in that room, and indicating this sort of ambivalent aspect, this someone who is betwixt and between? Rumpelstiltskin hovers in a liminal middle ground, oscillating between polarities with an ambiguously defined body and social behaviors which draw from both categories. And if you're listening to this tale, and you're probably listening to this tale several times, it's like, how about Rumpelstiltskin? All right, let's do Rumpelstiltskin again. And you're hearing the use of the neuter, you're hearing the qualities that are imputed on Rumpelstiltskin that are both and neither nor in that binary. In terms of, masculine and feminine, they don't reflect, and they reflect both. And you live in the world. And you live in the world, and you live in the world that is telling you that it is one way, and yet you live in the world and you know that it isn't that simple because of people in your community, because of life as you have lived it. Does Rumpelstiltskin become this thing? Become this opportunity for at least alluding to the presence of non-binary, and she will later talk about how we don't want to necessarily identify the kind of non-binary. Where does it go yet? I'll just see right now. Considering the complex nexus of possible self-identifications created through multitudinous intersections of biological sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity, we do not have enough textual evidence to assign labels such as intersex, transgendered, gay, and bisexual. Conclusive, though, is a non-binary otherness, a queer identity ambiguous in definition, yet radical in understanding itself as something apart from, yet in between the two established categories of sex and gender. Did the little old ladies know that? And I think that they did. And what's more, I think the Grimms didn't. I believe that's what Meyertholen's thing was talking about. So it's this wonderful argument to be made. And again, you might not be sold, because it's, at the very least, it disquiets if you're not familiar with folktale, it disquiets what we think the folktale is, because that is a complicated idea. It's a complicated idea that we shouldn't shield from children, but it's a complicated idea that we typically have not exposed children to because we keep them in this protected status. And if you imagine the tale to be essentially children's literature, you're almost pushing against such a complex reading. Not difficult in terms of unpleasant, but difficult in terms of whoa, there's depth there. There's complexity there. And I'm not going to go back to the well and just simply talk about how, these weren't always a children's genre. But they contain multitudes. They contain multiple audiences, and multiple audiences present even at the exact same moment, who are going to be reading them differently. They're going to vary from iteration to iteration to iteration to iteration. That's the whole point about the folktale when it is told. The Grimms solidify, consolidate, edit, and yet a Shir Yashub, a remnant remains, and you can still see that embedded in the text as a possibility, as a possible reading, a reading that she suggests is not simply possible, but once you see it, you kind of can't unsee it. And I think that's one of the great things about this kind of reading. And so I just think this is a wonderful new piece of folklore scholarship, folktale scholarship. It reminds us that there is, because tale is a product of human creativity, as much as we might be looking at it through the saddened eyes of having to deal with grim edits and this sort of misuse over time and his appropriation, and people don't necessarily like that it becomes adapted into contemporary forms, we can look at it holistically, and we can look at it as that they are articles, they are artifacts, I should say, of a dynamic, complex human creativity that was always there. People have always been complex and dynamic. They might not have the resources to, or the inherited vocabulary to articulate the same kind of complexities that we have, but that's only because we have the benefit of time and having accrued them. But deep things were happening, and tale could be used to explore those deep things. And that's what's just kind of great. Anyway, diatribe over. This is Ian. I've been talking about Andrea Meyertholen's Rumpelstiltskin's Queer Secret, and I have nothing else to say, so I bid you well. Peace. Bye-bye.